Once again, hello and welcome everyone. As I said, I'm Babak Salamitari, second year econ student. Here we have Keon, two more people will be joining us. They're running a bit late. Congresswoman, she doesn't really need an introduction, but here's her bio. She represents the California 45th Congressional District in Orange County. Before being elected to Congress, she spent nearly 2 decades as a consumer advocate and tenured professor at UCI Law School. In Washington, she has remained committed to putting Orange County families first, asking tough questions of CEOs and administration officials, as I'm sure you've seen on TV, to hold them accountable to the American people. She serves on the House Committee on Oversight and Reform and the House Committee on Natural Resources, where she just got like a promotion, I guess. So she's the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. And it's a great honor to have you here.
Thank you so much, Babak, for the introduction. It's really wonderful to be back at UCI. As you mentioned, I used to be a law professor and I live in the area. And so it's really great to be back in conversation with all of you. I know this has been a draining and difficult year at UCI and just want to start by saying how much I appreciate everything you all are doing to continue your studies, to keep each other safe during a really difficult year. So I'm really excited to talk with you about oversight. It is one of my favorite topics. I just got a picture of my new license plates for my minivan that spell out OVRSITE for oversight. So it really, really is a passion of mine. As Babak mentioned, I'm a member of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, and we nickname that CORE. And I like that nickname because I really think oversight is core to what the work of Congress ought to be. So when people think about what Congress does, they tend to think about legislation. They see those votes, they hear that Congress voted to pass a law. That is really important. But the goal isn't just to pass a law or have a press conference. The goal is to change and improve people's lives. And to do that, you have to look at the gap between what the law said and what's actually happening on the ground. Is the law functioning as intended? Is it being administered correctly? Are taxpayer dollars being used wisely? And so that means holding the government, large corporations, and other entities accountable to the American people. And this work has always been important, but it's taken on a new urgency since the coronavirus pandemic. We have over 10 million people who are still unemployed, particularly severe unemployment among women of color, in particular Latino and Black women. Small businesses are closed, graduates are struggling to find employment, and the lines at food banks, even here in Orange County, are hours long in many cases. So the federal government has a really important responsibility to try to meet the needs of people. And that means everything from supporting testing and vaccinations to adequate aid for people who've lost their jobs, to helping children and older Americans get the food that they need. And so a big part of oversight is to look at, are these programs working? And if they're not working, who needs to change what and how in order to literally deliver? So this week, actually, hopefully tomorrow, maybe even tonight, the House will take its final vote on the next coronavirus relief legislation. It's called the American Rescue Plan. And this is one of the most progressive pieces of legislation in our country's recent history. It is not perfect. There are things that I very much wish were in there, including a national $15 minimum wage that are not, but there's a lot of very progressive things in there. And it wouldn't have been possible without so many people lifting up their voices and making clear that they need help. One of the most important things that this package does is provide for what sometimes I think are wrongly called as stimulus payments of $1,400 for every American below a certain income level. The reason I don't like the term stimulus is we're not trying to stimulate the economy. We're trying to literally avert disaster. These are survival payments that are going to be used by people to keep their car, to keep a roof over their head, to put food on their table. There's also significant funding in there for state and local government That's really important. It's going to help us prevent tuition hikes, make sure we can keep employing teachers and firefighters, reduce unemployment among the government sector, which has been one of the few areas that has not yet had widespread layoffs. So I'm looking forward not only to passing this bill, but then to working with the Oversight Committee on making sure that the bill works as intended. And so that's a really important part of this, is the passage, but then the seeing it take action. I was really excited the other day. I was back in Washington, and I got asked to be the vice chair for the Core Government Operations Subcommittee. Now, I know that government operations may not sound like the most exciting thing, but as I talk to you about what it means to me to be a progressive, it's to believe that government can be a force for good. But to do that, we also have to be advocates for government working as intended, for spending tax dollars wisely, for making sure that programs are really getting help to people. So this Government Operations Subcommittee has jurisdiction over things like the United States Postal Service, over the census, over a huge number of how our government works, government procurement of technology, for example, which can have a big impact on things like breaking up monopolies in big tech. And so some of our priorities in the Oversight Committee are continuing to tackle fraud and abuse in healthcare and pharmaceutical industries, targeting predatory lenders and educational institutions, and then protecting federal workers. I'm really excited also because I changed committees. So you can think about committees as kind of like a major in college. It's where you spend most of your time. And I changed my major, so to speak, this year and moved from financial services to natural resources. And so the House Committee on Natural Resources oversees public lands, indigenous people, insular areas like the Marshall Islands and Puerto Rico, and then also oversees all of the mineral and oil extraction from public lands. Which is really, really important, and from the ocean and offshore drilling. And so we in California are already experiencing, I think, and are leading the way in thinking about climate change and how to combat it. But we know that this is not a next generation problem. There are already very serious consequences of climate change. We're experiencing them here in terms of wildfires, and there are very serious and longstanding issues of climate justice and environmental justice, people living in polluted communities. And so natural resources is a big part of thinking about how do we solve those problems. Natural resources in particular can focus on some of the natural solutions to addressing climate change, like protecting more public land, getting to 30% of our land protected by 2030. We call that the 30 by 30 initiative. Working to make sure that we're thinking about carbon recapture by making sure that we're doing reforestation projects. And so it's a really, really exciting committee. I chair the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee of that. It's the first time I've gotten to hold a gavel, and it's really, really exciting. And so I'm looking forward to being able to do that in person when COVID permits. But in the meantime, I just use a coffee cup to bang on the table if I need to. I also want to close by mentioning one specific piece of legislation that I'm really proud of, and I think is really a great example of where we in Orange County can come together across sometimes really difficult party lines to get things done. I lead a bill called the Ending Taxpayer Welfare for Oil and Gas Companies Act. And what this would do is raise the royalty and rental rates, inspection fees and penalties on oil and gas companies that extract oil and gas from public lands. That royalty rate has not been changed in 100 years, even as the costs and risk of drilling have gone down dramatically. And the rental rate hasn't been changed in 40 years. So this is a huge opportunity to save $12.4 billion a year for taxpayers, and at the same time, make sure that we're allocating resource use efficiently by making sure that people who drill on public land are paying a fair market price, not the sweetheart deals that they have been getting for far too long. So with that, I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions, but I wanted to set the stage a little bit and talk about some of my oversight priorities. Thank you so much, and I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, you perfectly segued into my first question, which is about your role in the Government Operations Subcommittee. And while I was looking in the description of that committee on the website, it says it plays a key role in the establishment between state governments and the federal one. And so what this really reminded me was in the beginning weeks of January, we had some issues with vaccine distribution, whether it was like a blame game. The states were blaming the federal government. The federal government was blaming the states. CNN said one thing, Fox said the other. So what went wrong at the beginning that limited us from getting vaccines into people's arms?
Yep. So there were multiple problems with the vaccine distribution. The first and foremost was very simple. There wasn't enough. So we didn't have enough to even come close to meeting the demand that every single state felt. And we weren't being, and President Trump, frankly, wasn't being honest with the American people about that reality. He would make statements like, oh, it's so great, vaccines are coming. But the reality is he did not use the Defense Production Act to speed the development of vaccines. And we just didn't have enough distribution. And I will tell you that the people in the Biden administration have said that when they got there, the cupboard was bare. Like they were led to believe, even they were led to believe there was more vaccine available than there actually was. But even if you only have a limited amount of something, you still have to get what you have out there. And there, I think we had very unclear communication. So rather than clear data, this is how many doses are going to each state, and you can look it up. It was just sort of like each state got some, call your state. But of course, there is no 1-800 number to call at the time to figure out where it went. And then it was distributed by the state to a combination of people, but primarily to local county health departments. And one of the things we've learned from this is that there's a sort of optimal size for a public health department. LA is too big. They're struggling. Orange County, big. It's been difficult. Long Beach has its own citywide public health department, and they are by far away the leader in doing vaccine distribution. So they have been moving faster and getting things through faster. But one of the other problems, and this is a great example of an oversight thing, is when they initially shipped the vaccines, the first dose and the second dose, if you're getting a 2-dose vaccine, it's the same stuff. It's the same medicine, it's the same amount. But they labeled them vial 1, vial 2. So what happened when they initially shipped them is they took all the vial 2s and put them over here and didn't give them out, instead of giving everything out and knowing that more would be coming to be people's second doses. So that was an example of something that we had to change to speed up the vaccine distribution. It's really, really hard to imagine. I think it's hard to feel this way at this point in the pandemic, but we're gonna give out more than twice as many vaccines in the month of March as we did in December, January, and February. So there is sort of a moment at which there will be enough vaccine supply to vaccinate everybody who wants it. Not happening today, probably won't happen by the 15th, but I would be really surprised if by early April, we're not seeing a lot of people be vaccinated. And I think it's hard, my kids feel this way. They're like, Mom, nobody gets to get vaccinated. The reality is almost 20% of Americans have received at least 1 dose, and about 10% of Americans have gotten both. So overall, 20% of Americans are in that vaccination process already. But it's not students and it's not young people. And I know that you are eager to get that vaccine. So I encourage everybody to sign up on the Athena website. UCI will get early and priority supplies. The UC is a big purchaser of healthcare services. So hang in there, but it is around the bend. But I think the main thing I would say is we weren't honest with the American, President Trump wasn't honest with the American people about just how much vaccine there really was, because he didn't want to own up to the fact that there wasn't enough and it wasn't coming fast enough.
First thing when I get a vaccine is I'm getting a haircut. And then my second question, it also has to do with the notion that you made with drilling on public lands, holding corporations accountable. What you said really reminded me of the Teapot Dome scandal, which happened right around 100 years ago with people drilling on public lands. And that leads me to second question, where we've seen how corporations and big businesses have left our state and have gone to places that are more tax friendly, there's less regulations, the environment isn't as big of a concern. So in terms of preserving the middle class here, what could be done? What's like the Goldilocks resolution of having accountability, but also making sure that the businesses stay?
Yep. So this is a big challenge, and really one that is at the state level in terms of the governor is really in charge, and the California legislature at the state level are really in charge of setting those state policies that differ from state to state. Part of what we're trying to do at the federal level is create that correct floor, so that should we have the minimum wage be $7.25 in some states, which has been unchanged for decades, versus have it be $12, $13, $14, $15, $16 an hour in California, that's one of the things that can cause those businesses to relocate. So part of what we're trying to do at the federal level is say, these are the acceptable, safe, and dignified working conditions. This is one of the things OSHA did, the office that regulates employment safety, is it basically said you have to have standards to keep workers safe. You can't make it cheaper to operate in one state by essentially putting employees' lives on the line to make a cheaper buck. And so I think part of what we're trying to do with the minimum wage, for example, is create that more even playing field for corporations so that nobody working full-time is living in poverty, no matter what state they're in. The other thing is the reality of California that I think a lot about here, particularly with Orange County, is we have an affordable housing problem. And it's not just at the bottom. Yes, the poorer you are, the lower your income, the more difficult it is to find housing and to afford that housing. But the problem goes pretty far up, so that we see people who are graduating from college getting good jobs as nurses, as pharmacists, as teachers, as firefighters, and they are having trouble affording housing here in Orange County. So we need to think more about how can we expand our supply of housing? How can we do it in a way that's consistent with our commitment to the environment and to our quality of life? But ultimately, that housing cost is a big factor of why people and why corporations leave California. And so it's not just on the tax side, it's really also on the, what does it cost to meet people's needs here? And housing is the biggest difference nationally. Healthcare, gas, some of these other things, yeah, they're different, but housing is sort of the 800-pound gorilla that really makes it cheaper to live in place A versus California, and we have to increase our supply of housing, and we have to do it in a way that recognizes our environmental obligations.
This is my final question before I let everyone else take over. So I was looking at your voting record and the legislations you've sponsored, you've co-sponsored, you've been part of. And then on the website, it goes a lot of like introduce. One went to the House, I forgot which one it was. But on a good day, how many of these do you think pass?
Oh, in a whole Congress?
Yeah, like when seeing all those things, and then given that there's 434 other people with conflicting interests, egos, whatever, like how many do you think of those are actually going to get through?
So in a typical 2-year Congress, if a member got 1 to 2 things signed into law, that would, and they were in the party in power, so the Democrats right now have control of the House, that would be great. So last year I had 1 bill pass the House. That was it. And most of my colleagues, many of my colleagues, especially who are freshmen and are newer members, had 0. So Congress, the House in particular, and you see this difference between the House and the Senate, the House is a team sport. There are 435 of us, and our power comes from the collective. It comes from a bunch of us coming together to do something. We don't have as much individual autonomy as senators do. So if one of us decides that we're not going to cooperate, we can't do a whole lot. And I think you're seeing right now, like my colleague Marjorie Taylor Greene is trying to figure out what she can do all by her lonesome. And one of the only things she's figured out that she can do is make a motion to adjourn. We all show up, we all vote her down, and we all go back about our day. So she can be disruptive, but she can't actually make any law. So I think the key thing about the House that I like is that it does take those alliances and that organizing power. And so just as we think about building consensus with groups on the ground, whether it's environmental groups or groups that work on healthcare issues, you have to create those same kinds of collaborations and alliances in the House to ever move your bill. I will also say that last Congress, we passed a whole bunch of stuff that we've been waiting decade to pass. So the Democrats lost control of the House in 2010. We didn't get it back until the new Congress that started in 2019. So there were things that were really important to us, like equality for the LGBTQ plus community, that we had waited that long to pass. So a lot of what we passed were things that we had been wanting to pass for a very, very long time. What this can kind of mean is sometimes I feel like we're spending a lot of time trying to solve yesterday's problems, right? And not enough time sometimes looking forward at the problems that are emerging and developing. But you definitely, like, you introduce a lot of bills, a lot of them don't necessarily pass. Some of them get folded into other bills. So I had a really important bill to me on mental health, making sure that insurance companies had to cover mental health. You won't see that bill, if you look it up in Congress, passed, because it got folded into the big COVID relief bill at the end of December. But what matters to me is that insurance companies have to quit scamming people on mental health claims, and that we're going to be able to hold them to account. The fact that it passed as part of a bigger bill, I got it done. And I'd rather have it passed today and help people and get no credit than wait around to get the Katie Porter Act of 2042 or whatever it's going to be in the future.
Okay, and I'm going to let Keon and then Katarina and Eric, and they're going to ask their questions, and it's going to rotate. Actually, there was one audience thing. They asked, which bill did Katie Porter get passed last year? The one that you talked about, that one thing, if you could answer shortly.
Yes, the bill I got passed was called the Help America Run Act. And it did pass with bipartisan support. I had Republican support on it. And it's a bill to make our representative democracy more representative, which I think is really, really core. What it would do is it would allow candidates to use campaign funds, that is donated funds, not taxpayer dollars, donated funds. They can use it right now to cover wine at fundraising receptions and campaign staffers and pizza. It would let candidates also use campaign funds to cover the cost of getting themselves health insurance and the cost of being able to pay for childcare or senior care for them to attend campaign events. And so this is a major reason why our Congress is full of wealthy people, which is that it's really difficult to try to make ends meet. Some of my fellow candidates went without health insurance while they were running for Congress. And so the idea here is to open up the doors a little bit broader, to let more younger people in, to let people with young children in, to let people who don't have family wealth or a spouse's health insurance they can go on, to make it possible for them to be able to run for Congress. So I'm really, really proud of that bill. It got folded this year into HR 1, the For the People Act, which we just voted on last week to pass into law, and it went over to the Senate, where every Democratic senator, all 50 of them, are sponsors. So we hope that we'll get that one across the finish line without a filibuster.
Sounds good. And then Keon, go ahead.
For sure, I'll take it from here. So the first question I have to ask is, what changes are you looking forward to within the next 3 months? Not necessarily COVID related or vaccine distribution related, but more so generally.
Yeah, so I think one of them is thinking about what we can do to restructure our education system for K through 12, and to some extent even for graduate and beyond. But we have kids who are going to come back to school at some point. Some of them have been waiting more than a year, and that's causing us to confront questions about what is the value of standardized testing in this environment? What do we do to help close some of the gap between, in reading literacy or math literacy, between those, close the digital gap between those who have Wi-Fi and those who don't. And so I think this is a real opportunity for us to make a really big investment in education and to rethink some of the core principles of our educational system, and to do so in a way that supports not just kids, but teachers. So that's something, and as a parent, I'm really ready for these people to be back in school every day. Like, I could only do my job in Congress because these kids go to school. And so I'm eager to do that, but also to use this time to think about how to do it better. The second thing I'm really excited about is being able to have a conversation and make a big investment in caregiving. I mentioned in my opening remarks that we have seen women, particularly women of color, exit the workforce in record numbers. Virtually all of the job loss that we have experienced during the pandemic on aggregate at this point consists of women, and particularly women of color. So there's a huge need for us to recognize that we need to make investments in affordable childcare, in paid family leave, in sick pay, to be able to keep both women and men in the workforce. Because the reality is, women being added to the workforce is a huge driver of our country's economic output, and it's a major factor in our global competitiveness. So I'm really, one of the aspects of President Biden's Build Back Better plan that excites me the most. When I first heard it, I was like, Build Back Better, like, okay, we're gonna build bridges, we're gonna build highways. But then I read it, and one aspect of it, one of the major pillars, is to build childcare better and to start thinking about childcare and senior care for aging parents as a major, major part of our economic infrastructure and our workforce development. So that's something that I'm really, really excited about. On a personal basis, I'm just really excited to finally see my own mother. I haven't seen her in over 16 months. And while I've enjoyed, sort of the independence of not having my mom tell me what's right or wrong, like so many of you, I really, really miss my parents. And I want to be able to see them and to do so in a way that's safe.
Yeah, most definitely. I like the point you brought up at first, especially where it seems almost we have a new starting point where we can restructure the education system to a more modern viewpoint. Yep. Katerina, you can go ahead and take on the next question.
Yeah, thank you. So you might have already answered part of this, but as you know, a lot of the country has been struggling economically because of the pandemic. And I think it's great that a stimulus bill is working on being passed, but obviously that's only a part-time measure. What do you think we need to be doing so that we can get the economy back and running, not even just to where it was in 2019, but to have women back in the workforce and things like that?
Yeah. So this is a terrific question. And I think first and foremost, we have to get the virus under control. So there is no way to completely open up our economy when people are at high risk of getting sick or of dying, if they go to a store, if they go to work, if they travel to their jobs on public transportation. So I think starting to vaccinate more people and being able to get the virus transmission under control is going to be very helpful. I also think that one of the things I mentioned about the American Rescue Plan is, those payments, that $1,400 one-time payment, it's not going to be enough to permanently transform and sustain people. But there are some aspects of this that I think we can carry forward. One big example here is the expanded child tax credit. So in the American Rescue Plan, we more than double the existing child tax credit. And so we add $3,000 for a child that's 6 to 17 years old and $3,600 per child per year for a child that's 0 to under 6. This was estimated to cut child poverty in half. And we have been spending decade after decade after decade throwing solutions at child poverty. But the simple reality of trying to address poverty is the best thing you can do to help poor people is give them more money. And the research all shows this. And when I say it that way, it sounds like duh, but that's actually been a long struggle to try to get legislators to be comfortable with that. In fact, when you give people more money, the first thing that low-income people buy more of is food. Because that's the reality of being low income in this country, is you literally go hungry, particularly toward the end of a month, if you're paid every month, if you're on SNAP benefits or something like that. So giving this additional money to children It will help parents address the cost of childcare. It will help make sure that kids and parents don't go hungry. It will help people be able to, stay in their 2-bedroom rather than having to overcrowd into a 1-bedroom. And so it's a major, major change. And we got that expanded child tax credit passed. And now we're going to make legislation to make it permanent, because I think we're going to see almost immediately that it lifts families out of poverty, and that that investment in kids and families more than pays for itself. And so I think there's a number of things that we're trying because of the stimulus that we're then going to see this makes a lot of sense to do overall, right? So making unemployment benefits a little bit higher. I don't know if you guys saw the research, but Stockton has been did an experiment where they gave certain people an extra amount of money and then certain people didn't. It was randomly assigned. The people who got the money are more likely today to have found a job and to be working full time. So that extra income didn't deter people from working. It made it possible for them to find a job, to travel to a job, to succeed at their job, to have childcare, to do their job. So I think we really have to use some of the data and some of the outcomes from this to then drive policy going forward.
Thank you, that helps a lot. Eric, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Katerina and Congresswoman Porter. We would like to ask how California should be handling the exponential increase in homelessness due to COVID-19 unemployment.
Yep, great question. So long before COVID, California had a housing problem. And I talked a little bit about that at the start, the crisis of affordable housing, Californians spending on average way too big of a proportion of their income on housing. So this is actually shocking to some Californians when I say this, but the general metric for what constitutes affordable housing is you're spending 30% of your income or less on your housing. And we live in a place where people very frequently spend 50, 60, 70, even 80% of their income on housing, which doesn't leave enough for them to be able to get food and medicine, transportation, and all those things. So we had a homelessness problem long before COVID-19 came along. One of the things COVID did is it spurred some new initiatives around how to address homelessness, including Project Room Key, which was an effort to rent low-income, lower-budget hotels that were sitting empty because of COVID to be able to expand those and turn those into temporary housing. We also faced, as you mentioned, this real risk of an exponential increase in homelessness, and that's partly going to come because what we've done is we've enacted over and over again now moratoriums on foreclosure and eviction, essentially saying you shouldn't evict on people during COVID. You shouldn't foreclose on people who are behind on their mortgage payments during COVID. What we haven't done is forgive any of that rent or forgive any of those mortgage payments. So pretty soon these moratorium will end and a lot of people will find themselves owing a year of back rent or a year of back mortgage payments. And I'm the #2 in the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and this is a big project I've been working on to try to come up with, and I think it's going to look different for renters than it does for homeowners. But how are we going to help people when we end that moratorium and evictions and foreclosures can start again? We don't want there to be a cliff, to be a huge spike in homelessness and housing displacement and housing overcrowding. One, because housing is a human right. It's the key to so many other aspects of well-being. But two, because all of that housing dislocation will also make us more vulnerable to another wave of COVID. So there's a lot more to kind of say there, but I think you're absolutely right that we are at risk of this, and we should have started thinking about this the day we enacted the moratoriums, right? Instead of waiting till a couple weeks before the moratorium expire, and then all of a sudden Congress panics and tries to come up with what to do. And I think that's a structural frustration I have with Congress, which is sometimes that we're not forward-looking enough in trying to solve problems.
So, Keon, next question.
For sure, Bobak. So, Congresswoman Porter, as we've seen recently with the January 6th Capitol insurrection riots, what would you say to those who have lost their faith in the integrity of our elections? And specifically, how would HR 1 guarantee a truer and fairer election?
Yeah. I think one of the hardest parts about what happened January 6th is grappling with the fact that the people who attacked the Capitol were Americans. That this isn't some other, this is us. And there were people at that attack and at that event from every part and pocket of this country, including from Orange County. And so there is a real loss of confidence in elections. And I think there's a couple things we can do about it. One is, I think as we think about electoral reform, we have to think about public transparency, and we have to think about how do we address this problem. It's not enough to just say, trust us, we're Democrats, or don't trust them, we're Republicans. You really have to say what would give people confidence in the system. And then I think related to that, HR 1 is really designed to address not just confidence in elections and election security, but also confidence in government overall. There are plenty of people who know that their vote is counted, but then don't feel like anything ever changes in Washington. And that's a different kind of problem than people worrying about whether or not their ballot's counted. Now, you may not know this, but Orange County is home to the very best registrar of voters in the entire United States. So Neil Kelly, our registrar of voters, is widely regarded as one of the best, if not the best, registrar of voters. And so we have things in California that I think could be enacted nationwide, like the ability to track your ballot. You can see if your ballot's been opened. You can see if it's been counted. If it hasn't been counted, you can see the reason, and you have an opportunity to fix it. So if you forgot to sign the envelope, or you put 2 ballots in one envelope and there's a confusion, you can correct those things. So HR 1 would provide additional funding to make sure that county election officials have the ability to make those kinds of innovations. It doesn't solve the fundamental problem, which is we have many states who are more concerned about suppressing the right to vote than protect it. Right now in this country, there are 273 bills pending in different state legislatures that would restrict the right to vote, that would make it harder for people to vote. For example, we just saw the state of Iowa pass a law that would reduce the number of early voting days. Yet what we know is that early voting doesn't create election fraud. It simply makes it easier for everybody, whether they have a busy day, whether they have transportation challenges, to actually be able to vote. So HR 1 is really again, kind of the federal government stepping in and saying, we want to create a floor to make sure that at minimum, everybody in every state has this opportunity to get registered to vote and this opportunity to make sure that their vote counts. But there's still a lot of work to do with secretaries of state and with state legislatures to make sure that state by state, that right is even across the United States.
Yeah, most definitely. And I really appreciate the insight that you're bringing to some of these topics that maybe a lot of us aren't too familiar with, especially us just being college students. We haven't really had the opportunity to vote in many elections or kind of see the results of our votes kind of change the way the government operates. So it's very interesting to see.
One suggestion for you all is once COVID is over and Babak gets a haircut and he's looking a little more presentable, you guys should all go on a field trip to the Orange County Registrar of Voters, and he will do a tour and show you how it all works, what the technology is, what the checks and balances, everything that happens from the day your ballot's created and printed to the day that it's processed and counted. So it's a really, really neat behind the scenes look at government in action. And the more I've learned about what the work is that the registrar does, the more proud I am of the kind of democracy and democratic opportunities, little d democratic opportunities that we're offering to people here in Orange County.
Yeah, for sure. And Katerina, if you want to take it away with your next question.
Yeah, thank you. So my next question is, in the Equality Act, there's a lot of great language about how discrimination, people have faced LGBTQ, women, and things like that. But what do you think are the concrete changes that could result from this bill? And how would it improve life for LGBTQ individuals, but also how might it affect gender segregated institutions like sports and women's shelters and things like that?
Great question. So the House passed both last Congress and then again this Congress already. We've passed the Equality Act. First, and I think we can lose sight of this in California, where we do have strong protections at the state level for LGBTQ folks, is that in many states, you can still be fired. You can still be discriminated against for being gay and for your gender identity. So while we have those protections in California, many states do not. So this is about, again, creating a minimum floor of human rights for people across the country. This would also prohibit, and there's been some back and forth on some of this in some states, things like housing discrimination. So it's not just employment discrimination, it's housing discrimination, it's discrimination in the ability to take out loans, to borrow, for example, and other kinds of areas. So this really provides that kind of baseline discrimination protection across the board in lots of different areas across the country, including in some states that have not given any protection and that have actually explicitly interpreted their laws to not apply. So when we talk about prohibiting discrimination based on sex, lots of courts in some states have held that does not protect against discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The other, you're absolutely right, there are legitimate questions around what the Equality Act will mean, for example, for women's sports. And there are interesting discussions going on looking at what has already been happening, for example, in the UK around trans individuals, people playing sports, the moment at which somebody makes that change in their life and how we think about that. There's no doubt, though, that the purpose of the Equality Act is to respect and protect people's rights to gender identity, including people who live their lives in the identity that is aligned with their biological sex. And so we do know that women, children who are perceived to be girls and boys are treated differently and do have different experiences. And we see that in classrooms, we see it in sports fields, we see it in problem solving. And so nothing about the Equality Act erases some of those realities of very real discrimination and very real different treatment among those who are perceived to be men and women and identify as men and women. And so I think it's important to recognize that the Equality Act doesn't erase sex, it doesn't erase gender, it simply creates freedom from discrimination in the most obvious ways, but it doesn't solve all of this, or does it purport to solve all of the different societal biases that exist and that powerfully shape people's experiences in their lives. So it's an ongoing discussion, for example, about how we're going to interpret Title IX sports equality, how we're going to interpret the people's ability to have single gender institutions. We're going to have to feel our way forward as a nation in doing some of that. But the alternative of shaming and of exclusion and of discrimination is clearly the wrong path.
And I totally agree with that. It looks like it'll take more time than just to figure out the logistics, but I'm glad it's working towards that. Eric, if you'd like to ask your next question.
So I'm gonna, since the time, sorry to interrupt, Eric, since the time is coming to a close, we've only got like 10 minutes left with the picture. I wanted to, when I was setting up this discussion, I really didn't know what to think. I mean, I'd seen you on TV, I'd seen you like with the whiteboard, you like kind of call rove people, but when I was looking at it, I didn't really figure out who you were. So my goal here was to figure that out. And what I realized is that unlike most people, you definitely care. You genuinely care, and that's what matters most. Like my policy differences, they're going to exist, but the fact that you care is what I believe matters more than anything. So I wanted to finish with this last bit of a question that most people, when they have elections or they're running for something. They've got campaign offices. They want to go big. They want to save the planet, help everyone, make the world a fluffier place. But when they go in there, like their campaign promises don't always add up with the reality that is politics, that is Washington, D.C., that's like the system in place. So what was something that you really wanted to do the second you would step foot in Washington, but then you realize, oh, it's probably not going to happen?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think for me, one of the most surprising things was that I thought, having spent my career as a law professor, having written books and articles, having testified before Congress, I thought I would really love that part of the job, the talking about bills, the debating. And the reality is, far and away, my favorite part of the job is the time that I get to spend in our community, because that's where I learn the most. Whether it's talking to people in groups like this, whether it's going on tours, whether it's seeing a business or an industry that I didn't know we had in Orange County, that learning part is really, really the most rewarding part of the job. And I think I thought I would, you hear this phrase, the halls of power. And I have news for you. The halls of power are long and slippery. The floor is hard and it is tiring. But here in the district, where I can learn things, where I can connect people, where I can come up with a better understanding of problems and a better solution, that's been the most rewarding part of the job. And that's really what keeps me going. It's the energy that I draw from here that then kind of allows me to survive the time that I have to spend in Washington. I guess the other thing I would say is that, when things are hard, the solution isn't to give up. The solution is to try harder. If a door is shut, you try to push on it. And if that doesn't work, look for another door. So one of the things that quickly happened to me when I got to Congress was I realized, as you said, a lot of your bills are not going to become laws. So then I started to look around, where is the ability? Where do I have an equal amount of opportunity? And hearings, those 5 minutes in which I question a witness, every single member of Congress, no matter how junior you are, you get the same 5 minutes. So I decided I'm going to make as much as I can of my 5 minutes. And so even though I haven't been able to get a lot of bills passed, because I'm a very junior member of Congress, I make the most of my 5 minutes trying to ask really good questions and trying to get answers for the American people in that time. So I think this goes back to kind of where we started, that we tend to think about legislation. I used to study the Dodd-Frank Act, which is a banking bill. And I used to think, like, it's so cool that it's named after Dodd and Frank. And now all I think is, oh my God, if I'm in Congress so long that I get a bill named after me, I will be so old by the time it happens. And instead, I focus on what I can do in the here and now, which is fighting for people in hearings, doing that oversight work, trying to really listen to and learn from my constituents, and try to communicate really clearly with the American public about what's going on. So in a lot of ways, I feel like at its best, this job is not that different than the job I had as a professor, particularly a professor at a public university. It's the opportunity to learn things and then to share what I know. And I'm just sharing it with all of my constituents or anybody who tunes into the TV program or watches the hearing, rather than just the students in the classroom. And that broader audience, it's really satisfying to feel like you're being able to share information with more people, including thinking about people who maybe otherwise wouldn't get that information. So for me, that's the part of it that I find the most rewarding, is not just what I can get done, but what can I do to help other people get things done in our democracy, to feel more encouraged, to know how to participate, to understand an issue better.
Thank you. I believe that they want to, if you have any closing statements, we'll go with that, and then a picture, and then we'll call it a day.
Well, I just want to say thank you to you all for doing this. And it's really, really fun. I miss doing these in person very, very much. It's one of the hardships of the pandemic among so many that people are going through. So I really appreciate your thoughtful questions. I want to make sure you know that our office offers paid internships. If you're interested both in the district and once COVID is over, we technically have DC interns, but everyone's remote right now. And we also have a youth advisory board, which has been a really wonderful thing that we've done. Every 6 months, we have a new group of young people from high school to just out of college, early professionals, and they come together and study a particular issue and give me advice on what bills I should join, what actions I should take around a particular theme that the group selects. So I encourage you all to apply for that. Keep studying. I would not be doing my job as a professor if I didn't tell you to stay focused and make sure you continue to work hard. And I know my staff wants to take a picture. So if everyone will humor me, I'll count us down, 3, 2, 1, and we can smile. All right? 3, 2, 1.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Please stay in touch.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. It was an honor, and hopefully you'll come again.
Of course I will. Thank you again.